Hi, I'm Susanna and this is my May reading wrap-up and June hopefuls. Today I'll mostly be talking about these three books. Let's start with The Library of Broken Worlds by Alaya Dawn Johnson. This is a science fiction. 17-year-old Freda has lived her whole life exploring the tunnels of the library, the celestial peacekeeper of the three systems. As the daughter of a library guard, she has unique access to the information stored in the depths of the library. When she meets Joshua, a mortal boy desperate to save Tierra, and Nergui, a disciple of a persecuted religious minority, she decides to break ranks with the gods and help them. For that, she must kill the bloodiest of gods. But first, she will tell him her story. The Library of Broken Worlds is a science fiction novel set in a far future society with its apparently AI, gods, and planetary wars. The concept of this book was certainly interesting, but I felt that the execution was lacking. The world building was complex and difficult to follow despite the narrative having tons of exposition. This book reminded me of the experience I had about 20 years ago when I wanted to get into science fiction, and the first book I picked up was William Gibson's Neuromancer. Unfortunately, I did not enjoy that book and it scared me away from the genre for quite some time. I didn't understand who the characters were, where they were, and what they were doing, so William Gibson's text certainly wasn't for me. I had a similar experience with The Library of Broken Worlds, although as I continued reading this, the world building became easier to understand. Considering how much world building this book had, I felt that it was badly explained. After the first 70 pages, I had no idea what was going on or what the story was even supposed to be about. Based on the title, I expected the library to have books, but that wasn't the case. How the library functioned wasn't explained at any point, and what the material gods were was explained only towards the end of the book, and I'm still not quite sure if the material gods are supposed to be some sort of AI too complex for humans to understand or something completely different. Now, this might be due to my own ignorance of the genre conventions, as I haven't read this type of far future speculative fiction before. Someone who is more into the genre will probably find this book more easily approachable. I had hoped that this book would work as a gateway to the genre, but unfortunately I can't recommend it for that purpose. I also found the characters thin and underdeveloped. Freda is basically the only character we get to know in any extent. All the other characters seem to exist solely for the plot. Freda's relationships with first Joshua and later Nergui happen at lightning speed. She meets them and in the next scene they're already together. There was little to no chemistry between the romantic couples and no information about how their relationships came about. The book also suffers from having too many plot lines. At first, Freda's goal is to become a librarian. For this end, she must compete against several other students. As a side note, that part of the book felt very young adult, whereas the rest of the book reads like adult science fiction. This competition plotline is quickly forgotten as Freda reaches her goal early on in the story. From there, the focus shifts to a lawsuit she wants to help Nergui win, and then to preventing a war that threatens to destroy the worlds. I think either the plot should have been streamlined or else the book should have been expanded into a trilogy. As a trilogy, the different plot lines could have been developed further and the world building would have had space to expand more organically. I also didn't care for the ending. The whole book seemed to be heading towards a different resolution, and what happened in the end felt rushed and undeserved. I battled between giving this book 3 or 4 stars, but in the end I decided to give this 3 stars. The writing was good and the world building was intriguing, but this book simply wasn't for me. However, if you enjoy science fiction books with complex world building and intricate politics, you'll probably enjoy this book more than I did. The next book is The Final Strife by Saara El-Arifi. This is adult fantasy. I actually finished this book on June 1st, but since I read the majority of this book in May, I'm going to talk about it now when it's fresh in my mind. The Warden's empire is divided by blood. The red-blooded embers rule over the blue-blooded dusters and the clear-blooded coastings. Saila Aljana, a 20-year-old ember, was stolen as a baby and forged into a weapon to change the empire from the inside, until her adoptive family was killed. Anor El-Sari has been told her whole life that she is worth nothing by her mother, the Warden of Strength. But when Saila crashes into Anor's life, Anor is determined to show her mother wrong by entering Aktibar, a competition where the next wardens are decided. The Final Strife is the first book in the Ending Fire trilogy. The story is told from 4 points of view. Saila's point of view is the most prominent, followed by Anor's. Small parts of the story are also told from the point of view of Hassa, a coasting trans woman, and Jond, Saila's friend and part-time lover. This book had intricate and unique world building with African and Arabic influences. There's a lot of world building, but for the most part it felt organic and not info-dumpy. I loved the feisty and determined female characters and the queer normative world. I also like the fact that Saila completely misses her opportunity to enter the Aktibar competition and instead mentors Anor. It was nice that the Chosen One trope was subverted by having her miss her calling. That being said, the competition was the least interesting part of the book, as it was pretty obvious who the 4 finalists were going to be. I mean, they were the only named competitors, and the end result was predictable as well. The competition aspect made me worried that this book would fall into some of the young adult clichés, but luckily that wasn't the case. This book is clearly adult, or new adult as the characters are in their early 20s. Readers who like young adult fantasy will probably enjoy this book as well, although I wouldn't recommend it to very young readers. There are a few non-graphic sex scenes and a fair bit of swearing. The book would have benefited from a few more rounds of edits to tighten the story. There's no need for this story to be 500 pages in tiny font. There was a lot of unnecessary repetition and some head hopping, and I felt that the beginning of the story dragged. I don't think all of the world building in the early chapters was absolutely necessary. The beginning of the book could have easily been condensed. Part of the problem was that I don't enjoy reading about characters who have substance abuse issues, although I thought Saila's drug abuse and her withdrawal symptoms were handled well. I also don't think this book needed 4 point of view characters. John's point of view added nothing to the story, and his scenes could have easily been written either from Saila's or Anor's point of view. Hassa, on the other hand, was a fascinating character, but unfortunately her point of view was so underutilized that it could have been cut as well. I also would have preferred it if each of the points of view had been limited to individual chapters. Now the narrative jumped haphazardly from one point of view to the next, which caused a bit of a whiplash effect every time there was a point of view shift. Not to mention that Saila's point of view dominates the early part of the story so much that I actually thought that this book was written from a single point of view. A more balanced approach and more early page time to Anor and possibly Hassa would have worked better. The relationship between Saila and Anor was enjoyably slow burn, but I wish there had been something more. It seemed at first that they were just going to be friends, and there wasn't enough pining to merit the sudden I love yous at the end. Also, if I had known in advance that this book was marketed as a lesbian love story, I would have been really confused with Saila's and John's sexual relationship. But at least this book doesn't fall into the bisexuals or cheaters stereotype, as Saila breaks up with John before she ends up with Anor. After the slow beginning and the debatable training montages and trial scenes, the book got better towards the end. For that, I'm giving this book 4 stars. And the third book is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Edmond Dantes, a 19-year-old sailor, is falsely accused of treason and imprisoned without a trial. A fellow prisoner deduces that the people responsible for Edmond's imprisonment are his romantic rival, an envious crewmate, and an ambitious magistrate who is desperate to protect his career. Edmund escapes the prison, finds the treasure his fellow prisoner told him about, and enters the 1830s Parisian society to avenge himself as the mysterious Count of Monte Cristo. This book first appeared in serialized form from 1844 to 1846 and was published in book form in 1846. This was a fun book and a classic I highly recommend. The only thing I knew about this book in advance is that there's a prison break. For some reason I thought that it would take place much later in the book, so the beginning of this book felt very fast-paced, especially for a classic. However, after the prison break the story slowed down. There's a big time jump where the narrative skips a decade and we come back to find Edmund as the Count of Monte Cristo. I didn't like the way the main character had inexplicably changed during the missing decade. We find him cold and uncaring to the point that he actually waits for a man's tongue to be cut off before he buys him as a slave. There were also several new characters that were introduced and I didn't understand why I was suddenly supposed to care about France or the super long backstory of the bandit Wampa. Especially as in the end France wasn't a major character in the story. And even though we meet Wampa several times, he didn't deserve such a long backstory. The part of the book that took place in Rome was where my interest in the book wavered. However, once the Count moved to Paris, things picked up again and it was interesting to see how the Count's long con against the three villains played out. The ending, however, felt rushed. The Count finally realizes that he has gone too far in his desire for revenge, but we don't see much of how this realization affects him. I would have liked the story to dwell on it a bit longer. The relationship between the Count and his ward Heidi was also resolved fast, and the age difference between them rubbed me the wrong way. He must have been at least twice her age. Regardless, this is a great classic and well worth reading. I also highly recommend this unabridged translation by Robin Buss. This was a 5-star read for me. In addition, I finished 2 non-fiction books that I've already taken back to the library. The Search for the Ancient Novel and A Companion to Ancient Novel. As the titles suggest, they were both about the ancient Greek novels. I plan to finish at least these 4 books in June. The first is Song of Silver, Flame Like Night by Amelia Wen Chao. This is an Asian-inspired fantasy. SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome by Mary Beard, I actually already finished. I also want to finally finish the collected ancient Greek novels. And I also want to read a non-fiction book about a year in the medieval Finland. In addition, I hope to read 1 or 2 books from my mother's bookshelf when I go to visit her. Those were the books I read in May and my goals for June. Let me know in the comments what your favorite read in May was, and I'll see you in my next video.